and 19 of our 27 affiliated societies are participating, as well as some guests from other organizations. So it's great to have everybody present, especially after a year where we have been so distanced from each other from time to time because of the pandemic. It is great to see the AIP community gather like this for this annual meeting. For years, our assembly has been an opportunity for the leaders of our member community to convene and learn and share information. And this year is one of those instances. I will note that we are recording this meeting for potential sharing for those of our community who are unable to join us today. Obviously, asynchronous collaboration is becoming more and more part of how we do our work. So thank you for those of you who are speaking today for agreeing to record the session so that we can share it more broadly later. As many of you will know, our program changes annually to focus on issues of the day, issues that are most relevant to our community. And so this year, with a new administration in the White House, we are turning our attention to science policy this year. We aim to learn over the course of the next 2.5 hours about changes to US science policy, infrastructure, and to the sort of construct within which we are doing science as members of the physical sciences community, and having a discussion over the next 2.5 hours with our keynote speaker and a panel of distinguished experts about how changes in the science infrastructure may shape the discussions in around science policy as we move out into the years ahead. I think our speakers today will certainly bring a variety of viewpoints to the discussion, educating us on the perspective from federal science agencies, from Congress, industry, and academia to see how potential science policy developments will affect our community at large. I will note, a program note, that the second session of our assembly will be held on April 22nd. At that meeting, we will discuss AIP's letter report, which is about to be released early next month. Some of you may know we released a letter report last year in July, focused on the impact of the pandemic, the early impacts of the pandemic on the conduct of the physical sciences. And one of the topics that arose from that report was how the pandemic was impacting society and association convening. And so under the expert leadership of Chris McEntee, former CEO of the American Geophysical Union, one of AIP's affiliated societies, an expert panel has been considering how scientific societies and associations might reimagine and optimize meetings of the future so that we can continue to communicate science and serve scientists at all career stages, and implementing the learnings that we've had over the last year of the pandemic onto reimagining the future of convening. So watch this space for the release of the report in April and the second session of the Assembly on April 22nd. Turning back to today, I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us from across the country to share their insights and give us some of their time today. We're looking forward to hearing from our keynote speaker, Neil Lane, who will be well known to many of us, former director of the Office of Science, Technology and Policy at the White House and former director of the National Science Foundation, and now senior fellow at Rice University. After we hear from Neil, we'll have an extended Q&A session. And for the second part of the assembly this morning, we'll engage with a distinguished panel of policy experts. We're delighted to welcome Richard Oberman, Majority Staff Lead for the House Science Committee, Victor Mccrary from the National Science Board, where he serves as Vice Chair, and he also is a Senior Administrator here at the University of District Columbia, Robert Atkinson, ITIF President, and also Rita Caldwell, Professor, and again, former Director, Professor of the University of Maryland, and a former Director of the National Science Foundation and a longtime friend of the American Institute of Physics. You will note from the agenda that we were hoping to have Cherry Pascoe, Minority Staff Lead from the Senate Commerce and Science and Transportation Committee, but unfortunately she won't be able to join us due to some late-breaking personal business that she had to take care of today. So we wish Sherry well and thank her for her support of our community. And I'm sure we would benefit from her expertise, but we have a great lineup of folks to learn from today, nevertheless. We will have a second question and answer session after we've heard from the panelists. I'm delighted that AIP's Mitch Ambrose, who is the director of our FYI news service, will moderate the session today. Mitch's team produces FYI, as I'm sure many of you know, as a community resource that AIP makes available for anyone across the physical sciences and community and beyond. Anyone who's interested in current federal science policy development legislation, key appointments, and federal science agency. Some of the trackers that we have now on science policy leadership appointments by the president, key legislation, budget trackers, as well as our regular bulletins and news items, I think are a key strategy for AIP engaging with advancing the physical sciences by making this news freely available to our community. Mitch will moderate the Q&A session. Please note that to participate in the Q&As, we are going to ask you to raise your hand using that Zoom function. Depending on your version of Zoom, you should find that either in the reactions or the participants menu, so check that out. We do have the chat function open, but we will not be monitoring it. Feel free, obviously, to have conversations there with your colleagues on the Zoom meeting today, but we will not be moderating it or using it for Q&A purposes. And once again, for that, you will need to raise your hand using the function as I described earlier. When you do raise your hand, Mitch will be calling on you to unmute and verbally present your question when we get to that. And we'd also ask you, if you're possible, to adjust your name box to reflect your full name and your society affiliation. If you right-click on your name on your Zoom window, on your Zoom tile, you should be able to do that without much trouble. So without further delay, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Neil Lane. Neil has, as I said, been both the director of the National Science Foundation and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He was at NSF from 1993 to 1998 and oversaw the establishment of several new programs designed to integrate research and education, the creation of an agency-wide effort to harness the power of emerging technologies, such as the internet and supercomputing for science and education, and oversaw a substantial increase in funds for modernizing scientific research, equipment, and infrastructure. From 1998 to 2001, Neil served as director of OSTP during President Bill Clinton's administration, after which he returned to Rice University, where he's currently a senior fellow in science and technology policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Neil has won numerous awards, as I'm sure many of us will recognize, including NASA's Distinguished Service Award, the National Academy of Sciences Public Welfare Medal, and the National Science Board Vannevar Bush Award. So Neil, without any further ado, I really do thank you for joining us in the AIP community this morning. I know from hearing you speak on many other occasions, you will provide us some thoughtful and thought-provoking perspectives for us to think about today. And so Neil, thank you very much again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you everyone for tuning in. It's a real pleasure to be here, even virtually. I wish we were all together today, but it's wonderful to have this chance anyway. Certainly the AIP and APS and several of the societies were really sort of my window as a young physicist to learning something about policy. Of course, much of what I was worried about in the early days was just more funding for physics and theoretical physics in particular, but we all come at it from different motivations, and the physicists have been very involved in a wealth of policy issues for a very long time. So congratulations. Of course, in those days, we were located right down the street from the United Nations building, New York City. So we've come a long way since then. That's no offense to New York City. So I've been asked to talk about the science and technology agenda of President Biden And if I could have the first slide, I'm going to use these slides just to make sure I don't run over, but I'm very anxious to hear from our panel. And so I'm going to clip along here. So I just titled this President Joe Biden's Science and Technology Agenda. Next slide, please. So here is the president's science advisor, extraordinary pick, Eric Lander, outstanding research credentials, his expertise, of course, in biosciences, is a mathematician, geneticist, and was the lead author in the Nature article on the release of the first draft of the human genome, first draft from the International Human Genome Project of the human genome sequence. That's where I first got to know Eric. He was the Whitehead Institute in those days, and I think Whitehead actually sequenced the most of everybody, of all the participants in the partnership. He has extraordinary administrative leadership. He was the founding director of the Broad Institute between Harvard and MIT. He knows about the White House. He co-chaired PCAS, President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, for all 8 years of the Obama administration. And of course, is close to John Holden, who was Obama's science advisor. And he is the first science advisor in history, that means director of Office of Science and Technology Policy, to sit on the president's cabinet. All of us, of course, were invited, at least since Bush 41, the late President George Herbert Walker Bush, Alan Bromley being his science advisor. We were all invited to attend cabinet meetings, and that was a privilege, and it was very important. But it is different sitting at the cabinet table with the president, vice president, secretary of defense, treasury, state, and so forth, and then the other non-statutory members, 9 of them that in total that President Biden has announced he will place on the cabinet. It's a singular recognition. I think it's symbolically important. I personally think it's of significant substance as well, but that's something could certainly be discussed. And of course, Eric is willing to speak out. Those of us who know him recognize that he will not be a wallflower. Next slide, please. So here's some of the cast that he started to put together. It's an extraordinary cast of leaders. Early on was announced a deputy director, Hollande Nelson, who I have not had the opportunity to work with personally, but quite an extraordinary appointment, because Hollande is a social scientist, of course, very focused on the interface of science, technology, and society, issues about underserved communities, underrepresentation, racial justice. So that's not only symbolically important, but of course, she is a very solid scholar. And you can bet that every policy consideration that comes out of this office is going to have been vetted from the perspective of these issues, these societal issues. And then of course, more recently, Jane Lubchenco announced as Deputy Director of Climate and Environment. Jane was former administrator of NOAA. She's a marine scientist, quite a good friend and an important leader. Earlier on, announced as a Deputy Director of National Security, Jason Matheny. Jason is an intelligence expert, will be working very closely, in fact, has 3 hats, I think, with the National Security Council and with the Intelligence Office. It's an amazing appointment. And then Kei Koizumi, you may remember from AAAS days, an expert on budget, top, bottom, sideways, served with John Holden in the Obama administration. He knows everything about the budget, and he knows people inside OMB, and has established a long-standing working relationship. He'd be absolutely key to Eric and the rest of his team in working in that important working relationship with the Office of Management and Budget. And then co-chairs of PCAS, so Francis Arnold, a Nobel laureate for working in biomedical engineering, and Maria Zuber, former chair of the National Science Board. Rita and I worked with recently on the activity that I'll talk about in a minute. She's an astronomer and geologist, so she cares about the solid bodies in the universe. And then, of course, there will be, I assume, assistant directors appointed and staff, and many of those perhaps have been named, but I don't have all of those in hand. Next slide, please. So here's the list of challenges that the president has given to Eric Lander. I mean, it is an incredible list of challenges. It's all across the administration's priorities, focusing on the pandemic, public health in general, climate change in particular, how to deal with climate change while keeping an eye on the market at the same time, and economic growth, health, jobs, future industries, the world leader. You know, the big elephant in the room, policy room these days is China, of course, the rapid advances in China and the planning that China has, I would say, has laid out aggressively. So that's on the agenda here. And then, of course, making sure that all of these opportunities, the fruits of science and technology, reach all Americans, many of whom have been underserved for a very long time. Next slide, please. This is just to remind us that actually all these issues, pandemic, underserved communities, global competition, they intersect with what many federal agencies have as statutory responsibilities, and will be on the front burner in many of the offices and White House councils, and the activities of the various czars that have been named: climate change, potentially, if not already, cybersecurity, and the pandemic itself, and other such areas. So there's going to be there's going to be a wealth of people focused on these issues, and so integration and coordination, cooperation is going to be extremely important. Next slide. So here's what President POTUS and Vice President Kamala Harris of VPOTUS will be a crew that they'll be working most closely with. So up on the upper left, those just remind us that the 15 statutory agencies, the secretaries and the attorney general, will report to the president, of course, and then a number of independent agencies: NASA, National Science Foundation, regulatory agents like EPA, and others. So that's where all the real expertise and the continuity of government exists. But then in the executive office, we have all these offices, including the Office of Science Technology Policy that we're focusing on today. And it has access to a National Science Technology Council, cabinet level committee, if you like, chaired by the president, that includes not only the cabinet secretaries who have a significant investment in science technology, but also the heads of NSF and NASA and many of the other agencies as well. But then there are these other powerful councils around: National Security Council, domestic policy, economic policy, environmental quality, the Council of Economic Advisors. They keep the tabs on the numbers and run the analysis on a day-by-day basis. OMB, they control not just the money. By control, I mean they watch the money. They report to the president on everything having to do with spending money, but also any major management issues. So pretty much all of the major policies go through there. And then, of course, you know all of this. Then there are the political advisors up in the middle. They swarm around the president and vice president. They're very close. They often get the most face time with the leaders of our country. And so they're critically important to moving policy around. And next slide, please. And all of this is embedded in a larger framework. So the White House, of course, if they could just do all of this on their own, it would be hard enough, but it's not the way our government is set up. So we've got Congress, the Senate, and the House. We've got 535 people, no two of which agree on everything, most of whom don't agree on anything. So that's a challenge. And in part, it's a challenge because of all this yellow stuff that I put around. And you can pick out your favorite target or maybe a favorite special interest, because in our form of representational democracy, we can't all go to the White House and the Congress every day or every few days and try to influence policymakers to pay attention to what we think is important. So we go through these various organizations, corporations do, non-government entities, soft lobbyists, hard lobbyists. These yellow folks, these folks in these yellow boxes, they plug into the White House, they plug into Congress, they plug into all the federal agencies, at least those whose business they're interested in. It's remarkable anything actually ever gets done in our system, but it actually does. It's hard, but with the right kind of work and navigation can happen. Next slide. So here's what I'm just calling suggestions for the science advisor from a long time, years ago, science advisor. And I'm not for a minute suggesting Eric Lander doesn't know what he's doing or knows what he's going to do, but this is just Neil's perspective. So I see an early need to define the science, what I call the science technology niche in the president's agenda. It's very broad. It intersects with people all across the executive branch and the agencies, and finding the right niche without stepping on other people's toes and contributing significantly where your other colleagues in the White House need help is a key thing to do early on. And then a navigation plan for how you're going to go about helping out where you can, and then getting help when you feel you need it for your own contributions to the president's agenda. Start making friends. Well, that means the West Wing, of course, cabinet, federal agencies. Now, in this job, of course, you don't quite have the access to the Congress that you might as head of an NSF that Rita and I had and appreciated and took advantage of. If you're working in the White House, then you need to work very closely with the legislative affairs people. But that can be a very good working relationship and a powerful one. Now, Eric, of course, knows a lot of these people. He was with the Obama administration, as I said, for 8 years, and a leader in the community, very much involved in policies. So he's already got friends. Develop specific interagency initiatives. If you really want to move some money, you need a good idea, and it needs to be broader than just, I say just, but I mean it in quotes, advances in physics or chemistry or biology. Those, of course, are fundamentally what's important and what makes the nation's future bright. But in order to sell it, you really need an initiative. Now, we worked on the National Nanotechnology Initiative. Rita was NSF director, NSF was a lead agency, and we worked hard on that to get money for nanoscale science and engineering, but it really was part of an effort to just get more money for all of the physical sciences. Remember, NIH in those days was in its doubling, midway through its doubling period. So NIH was doing fine, but physical sciences, engineering really weren't. And then another suggestion is, of course, influence OMB as best you can. OSTP doesn't have any authority over OMB. They don't really have sign off on the budgets or the policies for that matter. They do have a voice. So the issue is how to use that voice most effectively. Of course, cooperate with the National Science and National Security Council, other policy councils, develop international partnerships. It falls to the director of OSTP to be the spokesperson for the president, my last line here, on science technology matters around the world as well as domestically. It's a serious responsibility. And so the OSTP will sort of be the lead, will sit with science ministers around the world at bilateral and multilateral meetings and on various other occasions. Next slide, please. Well, this slide is just kind of remind us that about the White House. I title it's important to be close to the West Wing and Oval Office, which you can see where it is on the slide, but not too close, I would argue. It's debatable, but I think being on the cabinet is not too close because the other secretaries, the other members of the cabinet, the executive heads and others, they don't live in the White House, they live in their own agencies. So you have your staff as science advisor in OSTP, located in what used to be the old executive office building, now called Dwight David Eisenhower Executive Office Building. I discovered that one morning while driving to work. I heard it on the radio. My office had been changed, but it's okay. I found it, and they let me in. That's you can get from your office in in the OEOB to the Oval Office easily in 3 or 4 minutes. If you're in a hurry, you can get to the cabinet room, get to the Roosevelt room, get to see the vice president. So you're close enough and you're inside the security fence. If you're down the street, where some science advisors have had to be because of other events that were occurring, of course your badge lets you in, but you've got to go in through security. It can cost you a considerable amount of time. Even more important than that, your staff being located in this building, find it much easier to interact with their counterparts, National Security Council, for example, or Economic Council, just down the hall or down the next floor. So it's really important to be this close. But if you actually have an office in the West Wing, I would argue, yes, you're closer to the shakers and movers who are closer to the president, but then also much of that activity is frenzied activity, and a lot of it is political. It's very focused on things going on that have nothing really directly to do with science and technology policy. So it can be distracting. Next slide, please. The good news here is I think there are a number of reasons for optimism, not just the past election, and I say just with a capital J. Policymakers are actually noticing. Of course, the Biden administration we've already talked about, the elevation of Eric's position to the cabinet. The president has a very ambitious agenda, and it has an important science and technology component. Congress is also taking notice. So the Endless Frontier Act, I'll say a little more about, but others on the panel will have more informed information to provide. Endless Frontier Act focuses on the National Science Foundation and to some extent NIST. It's unprecedented, in my view. I've never seen anything like that coming out from the majority leader of Congress with bipartisan support and support in both houses. The RISE Act and other bills that also have science and technology components. There are also some significant activities outside. Many of you are involved with them. I just call them advocacy. 2 examples I'll just point out. The Science and Technology Action Plan. It came from a grassroots group that involved, I was in that group, had specific recommendations, quite bold ones, I would say, for federal R&D investments. Then there's something, again, a grassroots group called the Salon Group. I'm not part of that group. And I don't know where the word salon came from, but maybe some of you on the call were. But these are people, well, I'll give you the names in a minute, have specific recommendations about the Endless Frontier Act. So these leaders in our science community thought it was so important that they speak out on the Endless Frontier Act because it is unprecedented. And then finally, I would say on reasons for optimism, a time of crisis. Well, it's hard to associate crisis with optimism, but there's that statement, I think, that's attributed to everybody, at least back to Winston Churchill, all the way up to Rahm Emanuel, says something like, never let a good crisis go to waste. The point being, of course, pandemic is not a good crisis. Point being, seems to be the best opportunity when you can really do something transformative that you've been trying to do for years and decades. So we are at a pandemic moment, or we're at a China moment. We're at a moment in time when people are waking up who can actually make a difference. Next slide, please. The Endless Frontier Act. So a word about that. And I think you all know what's in the Endless Frontier Act, so I'll be quickly. It was primarily driven by Majority Leader Chuck Schumer from New York with his counterpart Todd Young, Republican senator from Indiana, and it has congressional support, both Democrat and Republican, on the House side. It proposes changing the name to National Science Technology Foundation, adding a new directorate with DARPA-like authorities so that you don't have to pay as much attention to what the peer reviewers have to say, a new deputy director in charge of this directorate, and it's a Senate confirmed position, new funding, $100 billion over 5 years for NSF, and then another 10 for NIST. New advisory board on technology with the Congress involved in its appointment. new scholarships, fellowships, traineeships, new initiatives running all across the country. I just call them lab to market initiatives of various kinds, and hubs and other kinds of organizations. And of course, very focused on workforce broadly, including all Americans. Next slide. Well, I'm sorry about this slide, but the one I could grab from NSF website. But the point I want to make with it is that this is the existing NSF structure, and ignore the blue stuff at the bottom. They're the other officers. But so you have, right now, you have a director, Senate confirmed. You have a deputy director. You have a position anyway. It's not always filled, Senate confirmed. And those are the only two Senate confirmed appointments in the National Science Foundation. Then you have down in the middle, 7 among the directorates. 7 of those are to fund research activities and educational activities, primarily using merit review, the sort of the gold standard of how to make those kind of decisions. The director sits with a board, the National Science Board, which shares a certain amount of policy making authority with the director, and of course the board has its own office. Next slide. But what is proposed in the act is to add on to this organization a new directorate for technology with a new Senate confirmed deputy director in charge of that directorate, a budget running from, it would be $2 billion additional money just for that directorate in the first year, on up to $35 billion per year for year 4 and 5, essentially the $100 billion spread over 5 years, and a new technology advisory board that, again, as I indicated, Congress would be involved in selecting. So I put this little box purposely higher because you're talking about, by year 2025, you'd have a directorate with $35 billion. And then NSF, the rest of NSF, which is currently $8.5 billion, let's say it grows to 10 in that period of time with reasonable annual growth. So you really would have a big tail wagging a little dog. And that was of considerable concern to people, and they have spoken out on this. Next slide, please. So one of those groups was the Salon Group I talked about, and they're the names of the people who served. And they published their online letter, and their editorial will come out soon in Science Magazine online, and then in the print editions, you'll see the whole article. They support the objectives of the act, but they're against the name change. They're against the new deputy director, Senate confirmed. They're against the new advisory board, and they want to see added protection for the rest of the National Science Foundation. Essentially, they want to see that the integrated nature of NSF not be broken up into 2 pieces, is the way, one great big piece and one smaller piece. But in the end, they make that very supportive statement that their recommendations they view as significant, but minor in comparison with the benefits that the proposed Endless Frontier Act would confer upon the nation's research enterprise. Very positive statement. Next slide, please. So a number of us got together at the club, if you like, of former NSF directors and National Science Board chairs. Rita, of course, a member of the club, and was in on this activity. We decided to see if we could craft a letter that was supportive of the spirit of the act, but hedged a little bit by not getting into specific recommendations, simply saying we know there are ongoing discussions, and expressing confidence that the National Science Foundation can indeed achieve the objectives if given the resources and the discretion, key word, in its implementation. So we wrote this letter, and we immediately were invited to meet with the senior staff, which we did. It was a very good meeting. It was off the record, but I would say it was very positive and constructive. Next slide, please. That letter referred to a new report that came out that I'm not going to take time to talk about because my clock has ticked out, but it focused on the on the importance of the nation's investment in research, particularly basic research, not just a particular agency, but all of the federal government, all of the many things agencies do that are so important. And it attempt to really wake up, I guess, policymakers to the fact that if the United States really wants to remain a major competitor down the road, we're going to have to make some changes. They're going to have to be big changes. Next slide, please. We made a number of recommendations in the area of funding and planning and so forth, education, workforce development. Next slide, please. On funding, we just pointed that dark blue line is a history of basic research funding by the federal government. We just pointed to the fact that there was a period back there, nearly 20 years of steady, over 4% real growth during some very difficult years when the priority really was on basic research. And then after the election in '94, the bottom fell out. Yeah, we had the NIH doubling, and yes, we had the stimulus money. You can see the bump. I mean, it's not exactly a damped oscillator, but ridiculous way to fund research. We say, let's get back on track and get the funding back up again. Next slide, please. I'm optimistic. These are my grandkids. Yeah, it's because I'm their grandfather, or maybe it's because they were trick-or-treating this about 18 years ago or so. But it's just my way of saying that there are all kinds of reasons to be optimistic, and I've said what some of them are. But let me just add that another reason is just our science and engineering, mathematics, technology community of researchers out in the universities and the national labs. No other nation has anything like what we have in scale, and certainly in maturity and who understand what standards really ought to be and hold to the highest standards of peer review, following the law, and in every other way. That community and all of you who are on this call who work so closely with them and support the activities that they're engaged in, that's a reason for optimism. No matter what hard times come, I think one can feel pretty good about that. And then finally, my grandkids are still young, the young generation, there is a chance they care about these issues. And I look forward to us working with them for as long as we're around, because they got some real challenges ahead. Next slide, and thank you all very much for your time.
Okay, thank you for that presentation, Neil. I'll start off with some questions of my own, and then I'll open it up to the audience, and I'll call on people who've raised their hands. So, starting with the Endless Frontier Act discussion, you referenced in the letter your call for making sure NSF has the appropriate discretion in terms of implementing the vision of the bill. Can you give a bit more sense of what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, we tried to choose our words carefully, and words like flexibility and but I think what we really had in mind, and Rita can speak to this. She's in our audience and also will be on the panel. One feature of the National Science Foundation that has allowed it to do so much with a relatively small budget is its ability to change in response to changing circumstances. The science is self-changing, much more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary activity, much more interaction between physical sciences, biological sciences, between science and engineering. NSF has responded to that, I think, effectively. And it's because they're able to integrate across the agency. Yes, there are disciplinary silos. There's still a directorate silos, sure. But the agency has been able, with a certain amount of agility, to respond. And I think if you put a division down through the middle of the agency that separates it into parts, you just put a big barrier in the way of NSF doing what it can do best.
Now, one of the key provisions of the Endless Frontier Act is establishing this essentially a ring fence around the budgets of the existing directorates at NSF to protect them from being siphoned away by the budget for this new directorate. Of course, there's this tension between the authorization and the appropriation committees, of course, on this sort of a topic. So can you give us a sense of, do you think it's feasible to establish that sort of a ring fence in this situation that the appropriators would be okay with?
Well, it's feasible. Congress does all kinds of things. I can't speak for the appropriators. I would never pretend to. And we make no comments about authorization versus appropriation in our letter or our reports. I see Jim Gates is on here. Of course, he was on our Perils of Complacency report, and has been a key advisor and player in all these policy issues. It would be a big mistake in my view. I mean, one perspective has been defended by those who are enthusiastic about the act in its original form, has been no, the putting the division down, it protects, as you use the word, it protects the sort of traditional part of NSF. But that begs the question, what's the traditional part of NSF? I think I described what I think it is, but the National Science Foundation is already doing many of the kinds of things that the Act calls for. I-Corps, I'll just pick out one. I think it started doing Subra Suresh's time at NSF, I believe, and then Rita certainly with that program, and others moved it further forward and invented new ones. And NSF is already doing these things. So if you look inside, say, the Engineering Directorate or the Computer Information Science and Engineering Directorate, you find research activities that are fundamental research in nature, but they also are very much focused on the possibility of future technologies. Of course, NSF has the engineering research centers, very much with an involvement from the private sector, and science technology centers, innovation centers of various kinds. So the one thing I would say is, what the Act is talking about doing is already there. Part of it is already there to some extent, and it could be scaled up. If you put a big barrier in the way, you can't get past the barrier. I mean, the money could flow to optimize the National Science Foundation structure and its funding to meet precisely the goals that are laid out in the Act.
Okay, I'll ask one last question, then I'll turn to some audience questions, starting with Jim Gates, and then I'll move to Tyrone Porter. So another aspect of the Endless Frontier Act that you referenced, there's really trying to engage more of the country and the research enterprise. So in particular, there's the NIST component around establishing these technology hubs. But abstracting away from that a little bit, and just this topic of general interest in engaging more of the country in research. Of course, there's mechanisms like F-score and so on. And when you were at NSF, you were involved in implementing the broader impacts criterion. So I'm curious your thoughts on what more could an agency like, setting aside the discussion of the Endless Frontier Act directly, what new things do you think NSF could do to really engage more of the country in research, both geographically but also demographically?
Well, I think, I mean, when I was at NSF, I began to talk about the civic scientist notion that we as scientists have a responsibility to try when we can. I mean, when it's possible for us, and to get out and get off the campus more and out of the laboratory, engage the public and policymakers. Actually, the term was invented by an outstanding speechwriter. It wasn't Neil's invention. It was Patricia Garfinkel, who worked in the earlier days with Congressman George Brown from California. It was her idea, but I liked the idea and I talked about it. I got beaten up for it by many in the science community that said, look, I work 80 hours a week. What do you expect me to do? Go on TV, write a book? Well, no, I mean, when you have time, in whatever way you're comfortable with, we can all do more. And of course, having said that, many people were at that time already doing more, and many more are now, and especially young people are interested in it. Then there's the idea of the citizen scientist, which generally I think is taken to mean getting the public actively involved in the process of science itself. And NSF has certainly been a leader in that area, but it's more difficult to know how to do that effectively. Yeah, you can do it in the classroom with the teachers, and NSF has been a leader, I would say, on the federal side in STEM education for a very long time, and has that part of its statutory responsibility. It's probably the most important thing that the Act is talking about, and that President Biden has on his list of challenges, is to get the larger public more aware and more involved. I don't just mean knowing more science, but having even a higher level of trust in understanding what science is all about, how consensus is built, and trusting science even more than they do. We do have the goodwill of the public. The trust level is high compared to most professions, not higher than the military, comparable with caregivers, but much higher than many other on the list, like lawyers and members of the media, I'm sorry to say. But so you don't want to lose that goodwill, but there's much more that can be done. Last thing I would just say, it's local. And you got to figure out, I'm from Oklahoma. Okay, so that's where I was born, brought up. So one test case would be, how is there some low-hanging fruit where the University of Oklahoma, a public institution, or Oklahoma State, and the same be true for public universities all over the country, can involve the public, can have some resources that don't require you raising tuition and doing other things that's not helpful for the university. Could there be some resources that NSF or other agencies provide that would help the public university try some more experiments with the local and state public, because we're all the same, but we're all different. You really got to start locally. And I think our public universities that are underfunded really need to be a key part of that effort, but they'll have to have the resources.
Okay, with that, I'll turn to Jim Gates to ask the first question.
Hi, Jim.
Hello, Neil, and thank you very much, Mitch, and thanks AIP for organizing this. This is my first attendance. Neil, as you know, we have been concerned and in discussions about the fact that part of the devastation that occurred around the pandemic was because there was not a sufficient flow of scientifically based information to the public and to policymakers in Congress. And so to me, and you know, we've had discussion. I said, to me, it seems like there's a hole in our ecosystem that might prevent something like that from happening. And so my question to you is, do you see any real chance that the administration, the current administration, has been thinking along these lines, and so that this hole might be filled? So I call this sentinel science. You know, you're looking around the corner to see what kind of science you need to protect the country. Is there any discussion that you're aware of this sort of thing?
Thank you, Jim. I mean, it's a huge issue, as you know. I mean, in the report that we put out together from the American Academy and Baker Institute, the Perils of Complacency report, we said at some point in that report, it really, even though it's focused on China and the competition, we said it really wasn't China that created a lot of these problems that we're dealing with, these chronic failures of our system, which I won't list, but one of them really has to do with the failure to somehow inform our larger public about that. You asked specifically, do I know about discussions, and I don't know, but the fact that Hollande Nelson was appointed deputy director of OST tells me that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris get this, that they understand this, and that's challenging, difficult, and we'll have to learn from what the social scientists have learned and tried to tell the rest of us about how to communicate most effectively with the larger public. It's a real opportunity. It's kind of the first time I've seen that emerge. So no, I don't know what the discussions are, but I see some signals that they're ongoing and that they're serious.
Thank you.
Okay, next for a question, Tyrone Porter, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Neil. And thanks so much for also mentioning Hollande Nelson being appointed. I mentioned that in the chat, and you know, we need to pay more attention to the social scientists. And this is a part of our conversation. I'm on the board of directors for AIP, and it's been part of our conversation over the last several months. My question deals with one of your later slides with regards to funding and trying to return back to that sort of steady growth in the funding that's appropriated for science. You mentioned there were like some hiccups and there were some dips and there were a little bit of recovery. You know, Congress just passed, $1.9 trillion bill. Looks like Biden is proposing a roughly $3 trillion bill for a lot of things, including infrastructure. What do you think the stomach is going to be for Congress and Americans to actually, increase funding levels for science after such huge spending bills have been passed or at least proposed?
Well, I really appreciate the question, and you all, there are a lot of experts online right now as we speak, including yourself, about what the likely answer to that is. Starting with the larger public, unfortunately, the larger public is not well informed about science, but they're not really well informed about government either. The budget process, what presidents do, what members of Congress do, what the limitations are, and so forth. So their voice does matter. They are constituents that members of Congress will pay attention to. But some of the things we're talking about right here, I often see members of Congress go in a direction that I think their constituents really would not support, but it's communicated in such a way that it sounds good. So I don't have a lot of confidence in how that effective communication is going to go on the political side. In terms of the specifics of the budget, of course, the immediate issues are what are the appropriators going to do? There's been some discussion of the Endless Frontier Act. Of course, there was, at least early, some discussion of going around the appropriation, going to the authorizers through reconciliation. It seems clear that decision's been made not to go that direction. And you really want it to be embedded in the appropriation. It shouldn't just be a one-shot deal. It has to be for the long term. So a lot's going to depend on discretionary spending. In our report that Jim Gates and I worked together on, one of the looming threats to to doing any of this that we're talking about today, when it comes to funding, is the $1 trillion deficits and the large building debt, and the fact that we pay almost 9%, maybe it's slightly more now, of our total federal spending on interest on the debt. And while interest rates are small, then that doesn't look so bad. But if interest rates were to go up 1% or 2%, we'll wipe out a huge amount of discretionary money and money in general. So there's not a lot of talk about that now. There are deficit hawks in the Congress. We hear from them. They will get louder over time. But of course, the previous administration spent an enormous amount of money without much pushback from these folks, and so my expectation is that it's good that it's not going to be an immediate threat, but we haven't seen, we really haven't seen what the appropriators are going to do. And then we've got our system of appropriation subcommittees. Okay, so if you happen to be in a committee with veterans, as NSF used to be, in an election year, you can forget the NSF budget. Okay. Well, now NSF's in a committee with Commerce State Justice. It's a tough committee. And so if if subcommittee doesn't get enough money, they can't do much. Not going to do much for NSF or NASA, who are both in that same bill. So it's a structural issue, and you have experts on that. So I won't go further on that. What the likelihood? Well, I think the majority leader cares about the Endless Frontier Act, and maybe, just maybe, that driver will influence all the rest of the appropriation process. I mean, who knows? Appropriators are bosses unto themselves, but a lot is going to depend on that. So I think we need a base adjustment, and that's what a lot of these reports are about. Our 50% increase that we talk about in the Perils report, and other reports that are even bolder, talking about doubling federal R&D funding. That's a lot of money. If you increase the federal funding of R&D, by 15% a year for 10 years, you could double federal R&D. But that's using budget office projections. I mean, these are bold recommendations. I'm also very worried about sustainable funding downstream. We saw what happened with the NIH doubling. We cannot afford to have something like that happen to all federal funding of research. A big bump and then disappointing decade or two following on. That's not good for anybody, certainly not good for the nation.
Okay, next, welcome Michael Morgan to ask a question, and we're going to go a little bit over the noon stop time. I think we have a little extra time since we have one fewer panelist. So go ahead, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Mitch, and thank you, Neil, for a wonderful presentation.
Good to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. This goes to one of your earliest slides that looked at some of the elements of President Biden's list for Eric Lander, and this was pointing toward how do you guarantee the fruits of science and technology are fully shared across America and among all Americans? And so my point is more about a significant issue in the US and perhaps globally is economic and wealth inequality. And this condition is probably intimately linked to the failure of the fruits of our national investments in science and technology and medicine being not accessible to the broader public. We're not sort of fostering a collective intelligence, and that's perhaps driven by issues related to intellectual property and patents. The notion some people have about patents being perhaps too often being upstream, so that they're basically industries patenting tools for research, and so that's perhaps not a really intent for patents, or the notion that patents are too wide because industries want to capture a section of a market, or just too strong, and so they're not able to license technology. Others aren't able to license that technology and advance it. So I'm wondering, do you see the administration looking at sort of intellectual property and patent laws, or the Congress doing that? So sort of make sure that there's broader access to these national investments that we're making in science and technology.
Thank you, Michael. I certainly hope the answer is yes to what you said. This is not an area I have any expertise in. I know in the next panel, Rob Atkinson, I think will have a lot of wisdom to share on this subject. But we do say in our report, our Perils of Complacency report, that that all of the regulations, including some of the laws dealing with patenting and licensing, really ought to be revisited, because there are a lot of barriers just on our own campuses in the way of faculty getting their ideas out, getting their startups going. So long as the Tech Transfer Office is told that its job is to raise money for the university, then you're going to have rooms full of lawyers and all kinds of problems and delayed practices and so forth. So I just picked that one little area to talk about. Some universities have said, wait a minute, that's not what the Bayh-Dole Act was all about. It really was about getting the fruits of scientific discovery and inventions and technological innovation out to the American people. And you've already addressed that issue. There are many barriers in the way of doing that. So I don't know the answer, Michael. I don't know if to what extent that's high on the agendas, but you can see things in what the president said during the campaign. And I've already commented on the way OSTP is evolving in its organization to suggest that this is going to be an issue. I'm always told, stay away from tax law. Don't tell the Congress to change the tax law. just it's a morass and there's no point in getting involved with it. Well, it's time. I mean, Bayh-Dole needs to have another look, see if there's some things that can change. There are possibilities of programs, incentives that the federal government could provide. Remember Semitech? We've been in semiconductor trouble before. We're in semiconductor trouble again. And maybe we need some bolder involvements. I would say just stronger partnerships between the federal government and the private sector, because it's the nation here that's at threat. It's the nation that's being challenged rather than individual universities or scientists or companies.
Okay, I'll take two more quick questions, and then we'll move on to the panel. So starting with Mike Farrar from AMS, and then we'll have the final one from Michael Maloney, and then we'll move on. I'll also say I noticed that Kevin Marvel asked a really important question in the chat, and I'll definitely get back to that in the panel discussion. Kevin, just raise your hand, and we'll have you, if you'd like to ask that in the context of the panel. So go ahead, Mike Farrar.
Thank you very much. My name is Mike Farrar. I'm Mike Farrar. I'm a president of the AMS, and my day job is with NOAA. So I'm obviously very happy to see Jane make it back into the administration. So we'll have a great voice for climate, environment, and OSTP, but she doesn't sit in OMB. So one of the questions I have for you is we're looking at the priorities that you put early in your presentation. Climate was there quite a bit, but it seemed to imply that it was the other economic, the priorities are going to be on other economic impacts of climate with industry. And I didn't really see any kind of hook there for increased climate research, whether or not that is felt as needed, or we already know what to do, now we just have to implement it. So I'm a little curious of what your thoughts are on whether there is room here in this, in this administration for really looking at more climate research, or do you feel, based on what you've seen, that really it's going to be focusing on what to do next?
Well, of course, I think there's a need for more climate research. I mean, there maybe aren't a lot of scientific challenges that are as complex or more complex than climate. So a lot of progress has been made and extremely good people working on it. But there's much more to do. One thing we've been missing, I think Jane really worked hard at this within NOAA, was try to get more integration within the agency between weather and climate, and the idea of a climate service, if you like, rather than just a weather service. And the Congress just wouldn't stand for it because it had the word climate connected with it. So it got beaten down, but there's plenty of room. To what extent it's being focused on in the administration, of course, I don't know. That list of challenges was just verbatim from the letter that President Biden wrote to Eric Lander, that I'm sure Eric Lander had a hand in developing. And so it may not have focused or mentioned research specifically just because it's taken for granted that, of course, we're going to need to increase our investment in research in critical areas, not just for making new discoveries, but making discoveries in areas that are important to application, like weather and climate and technology. And it may be that it's taken for granted in the need to list 4 things with some words in them. I just don't know. But given the team that's being put together, I got to believe that that the U.S. Global Research Program will continue to go forward strong, and that funding by NSF and NOAA and other agencies in climate research is going to be strong. But I don't have any inside knowledge about it.
Thank you.
Okay, Michael, would you like to ask a final question?
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. And I know we're running close on time, so in the last couple of minutes we have left, Neil, it just struck me that one of the yellow boxes that you had on your slide were science societies, and we have the leaders of 29 societies in the physical sciences and engineering gathered here today as part of this assembly. And it's also struck me in the as we were thinking about the Endless Frontiers Act that many members of our scientific community have very considerable and valid concerns about the Endless Frontiers Act as it was last year. We don't know what the legislation is going to say this time around when it is released in the next few days or weeks or so. But I think your group of NSF directors and also the Salon Group from Bob Kahn and David Spergel and others, I think hit the mark with regard to some of the concerns that the science community has generally about the original form of the Endless Frontiers Act. But on the other hand, we can't ignore the fact that it's remarkable to have the leader of the Senate and the Senate minority leader and other leaders across the House and the Senate advocating for very large funding of technology, and that is linked to our science in physics and physical sciences and engineering. What advice would you have for the leaders of the societies as we think ahead to trying to manage the policy world and advocate for our science while also having considerable concerns about some of the considerable changes that are being promulgated or thought about for NSF? Is there any words of advice you'd have for the societies here before we move on to the panel?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me just thank all the societies for what you're doing. I mean, as I said, I hope I said in the beginning, I think the physicists in all the various areas of physics have been very involved in policy for a long time, and it's had influence. It's made a difference. One message I might suggest is to try to work, and I'm not saying you're not already doing this, more effectively together as a single voice, not on everything because your expertise is in all the different areas. But I've often said this to the biomedical folks, the FASA folks, the bio folks, astronomers, mathematicians, and so forth. There is a common message that's powerful that all of us agree on, but we don't quite know what it is, and we haven't written it down. So we could, when we come into our members of Congress offices, or we write things, or we talk, there's a common message that has to do with why we're so, why we decided to be scientists, and why we think it's so important to the country and the world. There's a message there, and if the societies could work more together to develop that common message, and at least a very loose strategy, unconstrained strategy about moving forward, that could be enormously powerful. I mean, it's a whole greater than the parts kind of argument I'm making. It's tough. Everybody has their own boards. Everybody has their own constituents and support base. I understand. But that then does not prevent individual societies, whether they're within AIP or outside AIP, for telling the good stories about acoustics, or about the private sector, or about physics or astronomy or astrophysics. You can tell those stories, but it could be in the context of a larger message. So, and on the Endless Frontier Act, my sense is that the staff has listened and their leaders have listened, and that there will be changes. I've got my fingers crossed, but along the lines that the Salon Group put forward. And I think those changes are important. I think that would be consistent with the meeting that Rita and I and other members of our club had with the staff. And so I'm very, very hopeful that this can go forward. And of course, all the support for at least the spirit of the act, every way that we can all be supportive, while acknowledging that there are complexities and there are details that are being discussed, would be very, very helpful.
Thanks, Neil. I saw a social media post recently where it went something like, oh, I have a very good friend who's a scientist, and when I asked him what does he do, he says, I get stuff done. And the social media post went on to say, now I've just got my first vaccine. I get it now. And so, yeah, I think there are some very good stories like that we can tell. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Mitch, for giving me the time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, now we'll move on to our panel discussion. We're starting that a little late, but we had such a great set of questions. I wanted to let that run a bit, and we do have one fewer panelists. So as Michael mentioned at the beginning, Cherry Pascoe from representing the Senate Republican minority. She was unable to attend due to some personal matters. I'll just say quickly that she had planned to talk about there was some pretty big science policy legislation passed in the last Congress that some people might not be broadly aware of. There's a National AI Initiative Act that passed through the NDAA, following on the heels of the National Quantum Initiative Act from just a few years prior to that. There was also in the NDAA what's called the Industries of the Future Act, and this was something that was pushed by both the Democratic and Republican leadership of the Senate Commerce Committee, that requires the White House to lay out a plan for doubling federal non-defense investments. In particular, industries of the future is the phrase that the legislation uses. A plan for doubling investments in those over the next either 5 or 10 years, perhaps. I don't remember the exact timing, but she just wanted to remind everyone that Congress has already started to make some big moves in this area. So with that, I'll move on to introducing our panelists. So first up, presenting, we have Richard Oberman from the House Science Committee. He's been longtime Chief of Staff of the Democratic majority. And I'll give it over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Mitch. Appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's panel. In the time I have for my opening remarks, I'd like to say a few words about some of the science policy issues that the committee is going to be focusing on in the 117th Congress. Of course, the most urgent priority we've had over the last year has been in helping the nation's research enterprise cope with and start to recover from the COVID pandemic, as well as supporting those researchers who are working in the fight against the virus. As a result, one of the first committee hearings we had this year was focused on the impact that the pandemic has been having on researchers and research at our universities. I know that I don't have to elaborate on these impacts to any of you. You and your institutions have been experiencing them. Indeed, a report put out by AIP last July enumerated a number of the ways the pandemic has impacted those working in the physical sciences. And I think those impacts have been felt across all the various scientific disciplines. Now, we've taken steps legislatively to respond to that damage. One such initiative, and Neil mentioned it in one of his slides, is the bipartisan bill HR 869, the Research Investment to Spark the Economy Act, also known as the RISE Act. Had a lot of bipartisan support. Basically, the bill would authorize the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Education, Energy, Interior, HHS, Transportation, NASA, NSF, and EPA to provide support for research disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Support can be used to provide supplemental funding to extend the duration of a grant to a research institution or a national lab or an individual that was awarded prior to the enactment of the Act. Also issues awards to research the effects of the current pandemic and future potential pandemics. And finally, it provides flexibility on awards to account for facility closures or other limitations during the COVID-19 public health emergency. Now, as you can tell from the list of agencies and departments that were listed, due to its comprehensive nature, it's been referred to multiple committees. So the timetable and the mechanism for getting it enacted is still to be determined. It may be taken up in pieces by each committee that has jurisdiction. But the goals of the bill have very broad support on my committee and across the House. In addition, a particularly damaging impact of the pandemic has been on early career researchers whose work has been disrupted at a pivotal point in their careers, and it's been making it hard for some to even continue pursuing STEM careers or studies. And unfortunately, those negative impacts risk setting back efforts to achieve more diversity in the STEM fields. To attempt to deal with this crisis, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas together introduced the Supporting Early Career Researchers Act, which is called HR 144, at the beginning of the 117th Congress. The basic purpose behind introducing it is to attempt to prevent the loss of early career research talent by establishing a temporary research fellowship program. Basically, it would authorize the National Science Foundation to establish a 2-year pilot program to award grants to a highly qualified early career investigators to carry out independent research program at the institution of higher education chosen by the investigator for a period of not to exceed 2 years. To highlight the importance we attach to it, the Supporting Early Career Researchers Act was the subject of our very first committee markup in the 117th Congress. That occurred 2 weeks ago, and I'm happy to report that it passed out of the committee on a bipartisan voice vote. We hope to get it brought to the floor for consideration in the House in the very near future. That's complicated somewhat by the challenges of the suspension calendar that have been taking place for other reasons. But in the meantime, a companion bill, S67, was introduced on March 9th by Senator Blumenthal and 6 of his co-sponsors. So I'm optimistic that with support in both the House and the Senate, we can actually get this enacted into law. Now, of course, much more remains to be done both to help the nation's research enterprise recover from the pandemic and allow it to continue to play its key role in ensuring that the US remains a leader in innovation, as well as helping to address the ongoing climate crisis. As the administration and Congress turn to infrastructure and recovery legislation, our committee is going to be pushing for funding to help the research community both to recover from the pandemic and to help the U.S. address its competitiveness challenge. Again, the scope, timing, and specific legislative vehicle or vehicles for the next package are still being decided, as you've probably been reading about in the newspapers. And we'll also be looking to see what the Biden administration proposes. The Chairwoman Johnson, the chair of my committee, firmly believes that revitalizing the nation's research infrastructure is something that should be a priority for inclusion in any major infrastructure initiative. Beyond that, we also plan to focus our attention in the 117th Congress on the broader issue of what actions the federal government needs to take overall to promote innovation in the evolving competitiveness environment. As a part of that effort, our committee will be introducing a number of key science policy initiatives over the coming months. In fact, that we anticipate that we'll be introducing our National Science Foundation reauthorization tomorrow, Friday. And that will address a number of the issues that were discussed about in some of the Q&A and in some of Neil's remarks earlier. We'll also be working on a Department of Energy Office of Science reauthorization and a NIST reauthorization, along with legislation related to our other agencies, including NASA and NOAA. Each of these agencies plays a key role in advancing America's innovation initiative and agendas. And we're optimistic that working in cooperation with the Biden administration, we can help these agencies to each fill out their role in this effort. Finally, I'd like to close by mentioning a few of the legislative actions we're taking to promote inclusion and opportunity in the STEM fields. Something that is so important if we're going to maintain a viable STEM pipeline and make use of all of the nation's brain power as we tackle the competitive challenge that lies ahead. Thus, at the beginning of the 117th Congress, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas jointly reintroduced her STEM Opportunities Act, H.R. 204, and Mr. Lucas's Rural STEM Education Act, H.R. 210, with each of them co-sponsoring the other's bill. We want to make it clear that we saw these as bipartisan initiatives from the get-go. In addition, Chairwoman Johnson and Representative Waltz recently introduced her Minority Serving Institution STEM Achievement Act, H.R. 2027. And we hope to tee these up for movement on the floor and get all three of them enacted in this Congress. Well, I hope this gives you an idea of the range of science policy issues and initiatives we're going to be focusing on in this Congress. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mitch and our next panelist, and be happy to take your questions later.
Thank you, Richard. So reminder to the audience, I am willing to entertain questions after each panelist presents. So if you have a direct question related to something that any of the panelists says, feel free to raise your hand. I'll just start with a quick one for you, Richard. So as you mentioned, that you said NSF Reauthorization Act, you're going to introduce that tomorrow. So obviously, I imagine you won't be able to talk to that in detail quite yet, but can you just give perhaps a flavor of the committee's thinking around the Endless Frontier Act? I know that the committee hasn't taken a stance on this, but people, of course, are interested to hear, obviously the new version hasn't been introduced yet of the Endless Frontier Act, so you can't speak directly to that. But I think it'd be helpful to give a flavor, if you can, of how the committee thinks about that type of a proposal to, add a directorate to NSF.
I'm unfortunately going to be a bit vague because my communications director will kill me if I basically describe the act today. I would say in general terms, we share many of the goals that the act has in terms of promoting the role research and development can play in addressing societal needs. And that we see the National Science Foundation playing a critical role in that effort. We also, both through the NSF Act and other legislation that will be coming down that relate to some of the other agencies, such as Department of Commerce, we want to help promote more regional inclusion in the scientific enterprises. But we spent the last year reaching out to a lot of stakeholders, I think a number of them on this call, and experts to try to get a sense of what really needs to be done to help NSF continue to move forward. And we certainly heard a number of the concerns that were raised in Neil's talk. And we hope that the legislation we are proposing for NSF addresses a number of those. But, you know, we share the overall goals of making NSF continue to be vital. We certainly think that NSF needs more resources. And as Neil said, it needs to be done on a sustainable basis, not a one-shot infusion of funding. So I recognize that that's a very vague statement, but tune in tomorrow and it'll certainly be, barring any last minute snafu, it'll be out tomorrow, probably around 2 o'clock or so is when we have a pro forma session then, and that's the time at which we can introduce the legislation.
Okay, good to know. Well, I don't see any hands raised at the moment, so we'll move on to our next panelist. So that's Victor Mccrary, who's Vice President for Research and Graduate Programs at the University of District of Columbia, and he's also currently the Vice Chair of the National Science Board. So Victor.
Okay, I'm here. Thank you, Mitch, and you're going to bring up my slides, I believe. Okay. Well, why are you
I'll bring those up now.
Okay, fantastic. So while you're doing that, I just want to say I'm really excited to be here with the American Institute of Physics. I want to really thank Liz Carone and Mike Mahoney, and of course you, Mitch, and the members of AIP to learn how working to nurture STEM talent and skills and to build a STEM capable and diverse workforce and spur innovation and entrepreneurship. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, very briefly, is just a few slides on our Vision 2030 that the National Science Board put together and unveiled last May 2020. And some of the areas that we're really focusing on, some of them that were just talked about in Dr. Lane's talk, and some of the areas which I think you all can really make a difference. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that in implementing this vision, we have a really good progressive board who is behind this. And I want to give a shout out to Ellen Ochoa, who is our chair of our science board, who is really working hard and has provided superb leadership as we go forward. And then I want to thank Director Satyanathan Panchanathan, who's the director of the NSF, because working hand in hand, as you know, NSB is the governance board for NSF, and we're working hand in hand to try to make things go forward with this vision, because our report provides a vision of where the U.S. science and engineering enterprise, which is essential, we think, to our nation's economy and to our national security. You know, it's, if you recall, the mission of NSF has not changed from 1947, which is fundamental research, economic development, and national security. But how are things going to be in 2030? Because that's 10 years from now, and a lot of things have changed. So this vision lays out actions that the National Science Board, the National Science Foundation, and other national, state, and local organizations, technical organizations like yourself, can take to achieve the vision so that America remains, you know, a global leader in science and engineering. So what we started off with, next slide, please, were 3 questions, because we really believe, as it has always has been, even going back to the beginning of the National Science Foundation and even how we worked, you know, during World War II and some of the challenges we saw, that government, academia, and the private sector really have to work closely together. And when we're talking academia, extremely important to include not only the universities, but our trade schools, our colleges, K through 12, because that's part of that ecosystem that provides the workforce. But the questions that you can see here, you know, we had a meeting 2 years ago and we asked ourselves, what's it going to look like 10 years now? How can we keep our lead? How can we continue to empower businesses and entrepreneurs? Because that's driving innovation. And most of all, you know, one of the questions that came up when we, you know, when you have these sessions and you make a vision, is we brought up the question of 2045, which is what the Census Bureau says is that's when we will become a minority majority nation. So how can we increase STEM skills and opportunities for all? So on the next slide, please. The vision lays out actions we believe are needed to achieve the vision, and it has 4 goals. Starting at the top is fostering a global science and engineering community. We believe NSF plays an important role in America's international collaborations. We need to make sure that America, is a reliable partner and is at the table to avoid being technologically surprised. To be globally competitive and attractive, we must be competitive and attractive domestically, which takes us down to the second goal, which is to expand the geography of innovation. We must do more to create opportunities and jobs across the country. The board is committed to reviewing NSF strategies to expand access to and training in science and engineering in every state. I mean, a lot of times, informally, we say, the mission of NSF is create new knowledge and then make a difference for our citizens and the world. This will include taking a fresh look at the EPSCoR programs to see if it needs updating. EPSCoR, as many as you know, aims to enhance the research competitiveness of targeted states by strengthening their STEM capacity and capability. Our review will also look at how NSF's investments in research infrastructure can foster regional hubs. Equitable access to science, resources, and products is at the heart of the next goal, which is delivering the benefits from research. We must enhance the return to US taxpayers from these investments and empower the nation's businesses and entrepreneurs to compete globally. And we need to do it in a way that ensures a more inclusive enterprise and a diverse science and engineering community, which finally leads to one of the things that I really enjoy talking about, and it's something of a task that I've taken on as a mission, and that is how to develop a STEM talent for America, particularly domestic diverse STEM talent. Over the next decade, our nation must focus heavily on developing American STEM talent, including researchers and a STEM capable workforce at all educational levels, from skilled technical workers to PhD researchers. And I want to give a shout out to Richard Oberman, because early on, he was a strong supporter of what we call blue collar STEM, or the skilled technical workforce, because we need those people who are post high school, who have many STEM capable skills, but don't need a bachelor's degree, but are earning a good living, are actually supportive and a major supporter of our research ecosystem. One area that NSB will focus on is improving recruitment and retention among women and other underrepresented groups in STEM fields, including academic research, and ensuring that these groups are achieving leadership roles in the S&E system. So the next slide, please. So I'm not going to read this, but we got to develop that STEM talent. Just in the if you look at the American workforce, according to the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is in NSF, the US workforce in total is between 155 and 165 million. The STEM workforce, so that's from high school all the way up to PhD, is about 36 million people. Half of that, 19 million, is the STEM skilled technical workforce. So those are the people who are post-high school, but who do not have a bachelor's degree. That workforce, in a lot of ways, is an entryway to attract many of our folks, both underrepresented and rural, to get into the STEM-based skills. Because I heard earlier, we're talking about the industries of the future, or now I believe it's called the industries of tomorrow. I mean, if we're going to maintain, at least to stay on par with global competition in terms of AI, quantum information systems, 5G, biotech, and advanced materials, we need to get folks developed in that STEM workforce, and we need to get them now. And that's not just waiting at the college levels, because it's too late at 18 years old to ask a young woman or a young man to get in STEM. We need to drill down past the high schools and into the secondary schools. So if you look at the next slide, this is why it's extremely important. We think we're at a Sputnik 2 moment. I mean, and because I remember Sputnik, I was there. I was only about 3 or 4 years old, but I remember the hubbub that came up, when that satellite was launched. And then that started the race. And we got a lot of people involved in that. I was a beneficiary of the National Defense Education Authorization Act, the new math, chemistry sets, laboratories. In fact, that's what got me to study and go on to be a PhD in chemistry, because of this investment of nurturing the curiosity of young people. But as you see right now, we're not at population parity. 4% of Blacks or African American are still in the STEM fields, 6% for Latinos, and women still not on par, upwards of about 50%. You know, so that's why I say we're in a Sputnik 2 moment, because we need to have everybody involved. I mean, because if you look at the global competition and you put the global competition as an analogy instead of the New York Yankees, we're the Brooklyn Dodgers. And we need to start getting the Jackie Robinsons and the Jane Robinsons off the bench if we're going to compete. Next slide. Part of this is emphasized in a project that was just highlighted in Chemical Engineering News. It's called the Oxide Project, which was funded by the National Science Foundation and led through by the American Chemical Society, looking at the representation of underrepresented people of color at all professorial ranks in the top 50 chemistry departments. So this was a very good interest to me as a chemist. And what we've seen over the past 10 years, that's gone from 4.6% to 5.2%. So quite frankly, that is pathetic. So if you ask me, usually at the end of these talks or later in the question period, what can we do now? We've got to change those the diversity of the professorial ranks, because if we have this pipeline of people that we need to start getting in, okay, they've got to start seeing people who look like them. I just got off a call before this one, working with the National Academies, working with one branch of the military, as well as working with the Navy. We have a lot of naval warfare centers. We have tens of thousands of civilian jobs that they're looking to fill, and they've got to be US citizens. So we've got to dig down deeper to get that talent. And where is one place? Next slide, please. Is working with our nation's HBCU. So this shows the 11 Carnegie classified R2 research schools. You can look at their research expenditures, their NFX expenditures. I usually show another slide, but I don't, that shows if you look at the expenditures at some of the PWIs and R1s. But we know from the National Academy report that came out in 2019 that these schools and their TCU and HSI counterparts at the undergraduate level put out more students in STEM than PWIs. And for the HBCUs, they put out, they constitute 3% of the nation's engineering schools, but put 30% out of Black or African American engineers. So we need to build research capacity there. And this is something that the board is looking at, because there's a lot of innovations that come out of these schools. I mean, during World War II, when we were thinking about how could we do sustain blood and transport blood, it came out of Howard University, came out of Charles Drew. Unfortunately, when the Endless Frontier was written and the people and the folks that were gathered together, the Tuskegees or Howard were not part of that conversation. So now we need to expand that conversation, and this is what we can do. So I'm happy to say that if you look at the history of the National Science Board, when Harry Truman signed off on that in 1950, Robert Burns was one of the people that was on the board, one of the initial members of the board, and he was a chemist from Howard University. So next slide. So this is my final slide, because what I hear a lot from our technical organizations and from faculty is, well, Vic, what can we do now? And where can we find these folks? And this is a picture of Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he looked around at that time and he said, you know, where are the numbers of African-American and other, you know, minority officers? And he got the response, well, we don't know where to find them. He said, I won't take that. That's not acceptable. They are out there, go find them. Well, he did. And once they started that core, one of those people was Lloyd Austin, who currently now is the Secretary of Defense. So what I'm asking you, and end on this, is NSB needs you to help us implement Vision 2030, and we can do it together. AIP, NOBSHE, NSB, NSF, and industry, government, we can work this together. So thank you very much.
Okay, I don't see any raised hands right now. So we'll certainly circle back to these topics in the full panel Q&A. So thank you, Victor, for that great presentation. Next, I'll invite up Rob Atkinson from ITIF.
I believe Kevin had a question before we move on.
No, we'll move on. I'll come back later.
Oh, sorry, I might have missed that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and fascinating and informative conversation. I particularly appreciate you inviting me because I might provide, I'm sure I will provide maybe an alternative or hopefully complementary view. I also can't resist pointing out that Dr. Lane had a very nice map of who influences science policy, but he didn't put any think tanks on the map, which I'm sure was just an oversight. I lead a think tank called Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and we've been doing lots of policy analysis and recommendations around science funding. We wrote a very, I think, interesting report where we modeled how much science funding leads to more productivity, more R&D, more GDP growth, and therefore more federal revenues. We've done several reports on how benchmarking the U.S. In terms of university research spending compared to our OECD counterparts, where frankly the message is quite grim, where we actually are way behind now in our
Rob, excuse me, I'm sorry. This is Liz Karen. You're very garbly. Your voice is coming in garbled.
Is that any better?
No.
That's weird. That's never happened before. All right, if you want to go to the next presenter, I can switch over to my laptop if there's something the matter with this mic. Hold on.
How about the distance from your microphone? Can you move that a little back further?
It was back. That's where it was, and you're still having problems.
All right. So, Mitch, yes, we're still having a little bit of a problem. Mitch, it's your call. What would you like to do?
I'm happy to switch to my laptop, which might be better.
I would suggest checking if there's another speaker on in your office.
No, I do Zoom calls every day and same setup as I have now. I've never had a problem, so I'm not.
Well, how about let's move to Rita Caldwell before Rob, and so you have a chance to maybe switch over to your laptop as she's speaking. Sorry about that. Rita, if you could, are you there?
Okay, can you hear me or shall I put on my earphones?
I can hear you.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for including me. I'm really an imposter in this bunch because I'm a microbiologist, but very happy to be participating. I would like to also thank Neil for a splendid presentation, especially in the message to the societies and providing a common message, a unified voice. That is clearly very, very important. I'd like to pick up on a few, well, essentially 4 points and briefly address each. First of all, I'd like to speak to the necessity for interdisciplinarity. Scientific disciplines really don't reflect effectively the emerging and the expansive developments today in science and technology. I think some very good examples, which in a way sort of reflect on a program that was started years ago, wasn't terribly successful, but I think it can be now. And that's addressing the research that we do to national needs. For example, space exploration is one example where it's a requirement for technology, but engineering, basic science, social, behavioral, and psychological sciences, as well as economics. In fact, I would say that the linkages amongst the disciplines and the greater inclusion of the social and behavioral sciences are really necessary if we're going to have very effective innovation and productive technology in this 21st century STEM world. Another example of the necessity for interdisciplinarity is the current pandemic. Ironically, we're really in two pandemics. We've been in the 7th pandemic of cholera since the 1960s, and we have overlaid the very pressing and severe pandemic of COVID-19. But in order to address the problem, it requires genomics, certainly, medicine, of course, in developing a vaccine, but social and behavioral and economic sciences need to play a role, very obviously, from necessity for dealing on a behavioral basis with the pandemic. So this intersectionality in the 21st century, I think, is extraordinarily necessary. I tried as director 20 years ago to introduce a bit of interdisciplinary research. It was very difficult, but I think now it's pretty obvious, especially with the issues of climate research. Climate research involves surely weather patterns, but it also involves behavioral as well as understanding the social necessity and the economic impact of the environment, and certainly the science and engineering to address the issues associated with it. I'd briefly like to address another particularly important issue, and that's of science education. It's been touched on by the previous speakers, and certainly Neil has addressed it as well. While I was director, I initiated the graduate K-12 program, which was an attempt to link academia with the elementary, middle, and high school education. And that was a mechanism for graduate students to spend the 20 hours a week in their fellowship with the teacher in the elementary, middle, or high school. This turned out to be hugely effective, and a report was written summarizing the 5 years of the program, published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. But this linkage between the academia industry and the elementary, middle, and high school is critically important. And I wonder whether it would be possible for the National Science Foundation programs to include a fellowship program for high school students, or perhaps very talented middle school students, a way to provide funding for those particularly students who come from deprived environments, where this would be an opportunity to recognize their talent and to support them at a very critical time in their young lives. Just a thought, but the point is that we need to reach out and find new ways of addressing the inequities, but the unfortunate lack of success in education for STEM in the elementary, middle, and high school. And then I'd like to address the issues of funding. Again, very briefly, as was pointed out by the staffer for the activities underway on the Hill. Both Neil and other speakers have addressed it, but I think it's necessary to understand that, and I know we all do, but we need to reinforce the fact that it is the basic science that translates to technology, and not putting the cart before the horse and having an outsized funding for what essentially is the outcome and the output from fundamental research. And I think establishing a technology directorate is wise, but it not as a separate entity. I think we need to address, and others have said this, but I'll just reinforce it. We need to address enhancing the funding for the basic directorates, the basic science directorates of the National Science Foundation in a sustained way. It is unfortunate, as I sometimes put it, that we have to say that no one ever died of physics, maybe not directly anyway, and hence we don't have the poster child for addressing the necessity for the funding. But it is, and I think it was Harold Varmus who said that when you pull aside the curtain, the discovery that you have seen, when you pull aside the curtain, the hand on the lever is the fundamental scientist funded by the National Science Foundation. So I think that the basic research creates and drives the technology applications, and we need to have that as a reminder. And then finally, one other point that I would like to make is the necessity for the interagency collaboration that I experienced directly when I was leading the National Science Foundation. At the time that I was director, 9/11 occurred. It was followed by the anthrax episode. And what many people don't know, in fact, very few know, is that I ran an interagency team. We met every week for 3 years, and then every month for another 3 years. It was a group from about 17 of the agencies where we focused on advising the FBI and the CIA on seeking out the perpetrator of the anthrax bioterrorism event. It was successful, and we provided, by working together and co-funding, the development of sequencing capacity to be able to identify the source of the anthrax. This was an informal but a very effective, collaborative interagency team that worked on a national need and worked directly with the CIA and the FBI in solving that particular national urgency. So I think these words have touched on a few areas amongst the many that we have facing us as a nation. And my final comment I'll make, and this addresses Dick Mccrary's comment in my book on sexism in science. Some of the inhibitions and some of the, let's say, the blocks that occur for women in science are described and outlined. But the message really is, why would you fight a war with half an army when you have essentially a national need at the moment for scientific, engineering, math, medical talent, when you are addressing the battle with about 48% women representing 52%, 51 or 52% of the population, why would you not include that other more than half of the talent? So these are just some, I guess, comments meant to instigate a bit of discussion and some questions. So I thank you very much for having the opportunity to participate in this really important discussion, to the team who represent the best and brightest of our science, engineering, mathematics, and medical talent in our country. So thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Does anyone have a question for Rita right now before we move on? I don't see. Oh, I see one. Paula from AAS, you're welcome to ask your question.
Hello, I'm the current president of the American Astronomical Society, and I just have a question about, I think interdisciplinary is great, and the combination of science and technology can produce great things. But what is the role of NSF and just the government agencies when there is a conflict between the technology being produced, the engineering being done, and the science that's involved? For example, we have this whole business of the low Earth orbit satellites. The technology is wonderful. It's going to produce global broadband, so the results are good. The engineering is wonderful, but it impacts our science that can be done for astronomy. So, how can we negotiate in the best way to meet the needs of both science and technology?
I think you're addressing a very, very key issue, and I thank you for the question. And I would certainly welcome my colleagues on the panel to comment as well. But I think the important point that I would like to make is that it's not either or, and it's a necessity to determine the balance of how the funding allows for the maximum output and success. So that, for example, there are surprising applications that come from the technological developments. In astronomy, for example, I think not many people know that the lenses that have been developed have been actually adapted to medical human applications in improving eyesight, for example. So I think some of the applications that we don't expect do come out of the technology, but it's the balancing of the funding to ensure that the science gets done, as well as the technology therefrom, or the development of the technology to enhance the science. Probably not a good answer, but I think I'll wait for my colleagues to chime in.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll move on now, and we'll have close to a full half hour at the end for questions. So start brainstorming. Now we'll go back to Robert Atkinson now, and he's the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And Rob, welcome back.
Thank you. How's that?
Much better.
Ah,
go ahead.
Beautiful. No. Okay. Now are we good?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry. So let me start. I thank you again. It's really a pleasure to be here. But let me start by arguing. I think we're at a turning point in U.S. science policy, akin to what Vannevar Bush articulated in his 1945 report at Science: The Endless Frontier. As you all know, in that report, he articulated a new role for federal science policy based largely on what's called the linear model. You put inputs into basic research and out comes all these other things that we want: national security, new products, et cetera. And Bush quoted a nice quote: "Scientific progress on the broad front results from the free play of free intellects working on subjects of their own choice in the manner dictated by their curiosity for the exploration of the unknown." That really is the current paradigm, certainly for NSF. Now, obviously, there's mission-oriented agencies who use science to accomplish their mission, but that is the NSF paradigm. And it was even reflected by the terms used. So there was this notion of pure versus applied research. And would have been just as good to say pure versus impure research. I mean, it's like pure being good, everything else not being good. When you go through Endless Frontier, you see that science is mentioned 119 times and technology only 5 times. During that period, when the whole question of the creation of NSF was under debate, as many of you may all know, there was a huge debate with West Virginia Democratic Senator Harley Kilgore. And Kilgore wanted a national science foundation that was more oriented to responding to articulated national needs, as opposed to, say, the Bush view, which was let scientists do what they want and that will automatically generate the benefits that we need. You can make a very good case that that model worked quite well for the US for a long, long time. In the 1960s, the US government funded more R&D than every other country combined, every other country, government and business. So add every business in the world other than US business and every other government, USG was putting more money into R&D. So few countries or few firms outside the US even had the capability to use and build off what is essentially a global public good that we were investing in. We were investing in a global public good of basic science. And we benefited the most from that because we had the best system, the best talent, the best firms, most innovative entrepreneurial ecosystem. That now is fundamentally different. Most advanced countries have very sophisticated technology firms, very good innovation ecosystems. And of course, China. China is the single thing that's changing this debate in Washington more than any other. I was happen to have the honor of co-chairing the U.S.-China Innovation Experts Group in the Obama administration. And so I've studied Chinese tech policy for many, many years. And I can tell you, they want to not just increase their share of global innovation industries and products and markets, they want to dominate. They want to dominate in semiconductors. They want to dominate in large molecule biotech. They want to dominate in aerospace, AI, you name it. Now, the challenge with doing what we have been doing, I would argue, is that there are very good studies from economists that show that basic science spills over to internationals. We can't keep the benefits of basic science in our country, nor should we want to. It's a global good, as I said. That spills over much more than applied research and technology research, which is we're able to keep that more to ourselves. So I would argue that it's time to begin to rebalance that. That means more than just supporting basic research. It means stronger links with industry. It means research that's aligned with key national goals, as opposed to just whatever researchers want. And President Biden alluded to that in his noted letter to OSTP Director Lander. And he said that we need to make sure that the U.S. is a world leader in technologies and industries of the future. We saw that from Dr. Lane before. The challenge today is that there's no mission, there's no agency with that mission. There just simply isn't. DOD doesn't have that as its mission. NIH is health, ag is ag, NASA's space, DOE is energy, NSF is science. There's no agency that has spurring and advancing and ensuring that the U.S. leads in commercial innovation. And increasingly, commercial innovation is central to defense innovation. Much of where the DoD wants to go now relies on dual use technology applications, autonomous systems being one, AI obviously being another. So let me suggest maybe 5 or 6 principles, and then I'll close, for how should Congress, I would argue, think about this. One is the challenge is not incremental. The challenge is huge. China's putting $100 billion into semiconductors. They're putting over $100 billion just into robotics. They are just betting the farm on this, and they can do it because they can immiserate their population and take money from it. We can't do that, but we certainly can and should be doing more. And that's why I think the Endless Frontier Act is such an important step, because it's really upping the ante. Secondly, I think we need to not just say, hey, whatever researchers want to do is fine. We know what the top technologies are. Now we can quibble in the Endless Frontier Act. Are those 10 exactly the right one, or would you swap out something else for something else? I don't think that's a very important question. It's pretty good consensus that those technologies that the Endless Frontier Acts identify are going to be pretty important to U.S. Commercial prosperity in the future, to productivity, and to national security. So absolutely, in my view, it's very appropriate for Congress to say, we're going to target these areas. Third, I don't think we can afford, as I said before, this notion we just do basic research. As Don Stokes in his famous book talked about strategic research. In other words, early stage research focused on key needs. We need to be doing more of that, for example, in the semiconductor industry. But we also need to be funding a lot more applied research, test beds. I mean, to me, one of the most interesting and successful programs at NSF is the IUCRC program, the Industry University Cooperative Research Center program. That program, in my opinion, is much more successful than the ERC program because it requires industry to put some skin in the game. They have to put money into these centers, and as a result, that technology gets transferred. The research is oriented to these needs, and it's also, by the way, it's still good research, as the NSF evaluation of that program shows. PhDs come out of it, solid research, journal articles, and it's applied to industry. I think there have to be incentives for transferring technology to industry. I don't think we can just assume that because it's at a university. In fact, frankly, a lot of universities now, they transfer their technology and it goes to Chinese industries. Sometimes that's illegal in terms of how they do it. Sometimes it's just, frankly, every time I would argue it's inappropriate. And lastly, I would argue engineering is critical. It's easy to forget engineering. If you think about the US versus other countries on a broad, generalized scale, we're really good at science. We're not as good at engineering relative to our competitors. The Germans, I would argue, the Japanese, and even the Chinese, They're very strong in engineering, and that matters. So we need to make sure that it's not just science, but it's also engineering. I just close by saying a couple of changes I would make, or areas to strengthen or support in Endless Frontier, which I think is a great act. One is we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the program in there about the tech hub idea to create 10 technology hubs around the country. That was our idea. That was ITIF's idea. We did a report with Brookings on that. There's real opportunity in places like Pittsburgh or St. Louis or Birmingham, Alabama, with very strong research universities, but they aren't over the hump yet. They're not the Stanfords of the world or the MITs. EPSCoR, look, EPSCoR has been going on for 30 years. It's largely a symbolic program. It doesn't do that. Secondly, I would argue that the act needs to strengthen, not weaken some of the requirements in there that these programs be industry linked. There's a lot of language that's there, hortatory language, but doesn't mean it's going to happen. And absolutely, I think we should have a Senate confirmed director and advisory board. The whole point is not to just give NSF money. That's not the point of this. If the science community doesn't really want that, then I think we should just have a separate agency. Just fine. If I get your point that you don't think that you don't want to see the NSF culture change, fine. But then I think what we need, if that's not on the table, then I think we should talk about a national technology agency. If we can't sort of put this into NSF and have it do what we want to do. So I'll just stop there, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Robert. So any questions from the audience before we invite the whole panel back up for cross-cutting questions? I see we have one from Michael Morgan. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Atkinson, Dr. Atkinson, for your presentation. So that last point you made about having perhaps a separate agency, maybe that is something that certainly people have considered that notion, because the culture of NSF, I agree, could be changed. They could be a bit more tolerant of risk in the proposals that they have, but the funding levels certainly for the directorates have been low. They have far more proposals that are rated in a very high quality that they can't fund. So there's a funding issue that's separate from the issue that you are addressing. But one of the things that was mentioned is that the effective, global gold standard of how research, peer-reviewed research, that process, that merit-based research review, is something that's deeply ingrained in the culture, and is something that I think if it were, loosened for a separate directorate, I think there would be concerns that people have. And I think the culture where merit review is a big part of what goes on at NSF in terms of trying to find the proposals that should be advanced for funding, and having a directorate which doesn't actually play by those same rules, I think is going to create enormous tension in the notion, let me just, move my proposals or my ideas over to another side of NSF because I think I might get a better chance of getting it funded. So increasing funding for the research that's currently being done at NSF, creating another agency that perhaps does the functions that are being suggested for this new directorate might be a direction to go. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael. I mean, it seems to me there's really we got three options here. There's a sense we've got to do this, so we could just kind of not do it and really work just with NSF and support NSF. And by the way, just to be clear, I mean, NSF to me is a national treasure. The peer review system, none of what I said was intended to be critical of NSF. It was more to argue that there's another challenge that the country faces. I think we should expand NSF funding significantly and keep the peer review system. I'm for that. My only point is there's this other challenge, and so I think we only have sort of three possible solutions. One is just give, whatever $40 billion to NSF and hope that through that process we get what we want. I don't think that's going to happen. Second, we could do this what's in the bill, and I agree that creates some possible tensions. And is it worth the tensions? Is it worth the risk? That's kind of a question for the science community, I guess. And the third would just be to create something else. Now, the problem with creating a national technology agency, or as the Eric Schmidt's new study, a new commission, the DoD AI commission that was reported to Congress, I guess 2 weeks ago, they actually proposed a national technology foundation. But the problem obviously is congressional will. Congress historically doesn't like creating brand new things, and it's easier to bump up and ramp up existing things. So That's luckily not that's kind of a Richard issue more than it is a my issue. But I think those are the three choices.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll move to Jim Gates. Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Robert, for that fine presentation. This issue about the culture of the Science Foundation is something that many of us have visited on a number of times. And in particular, you in fact identified something that many of us think needs to find a way to change, namely the reliance on a single technology for the assessment of quality and then funding. We know that there are other models. For example, the other extreme that some of us think about a lot is DARPA, right? Where it's not peer review that drives the thrusts in which are supported and which have gone on to be fantastically successful drivers for our industry. And so I agree with you in principle that we need to look at other sorts of ways of funding this. In fact, there is a PCAST report. I hate to return to PCAST, but in 2017, we came to the same conclusion that one ought to have a portfolio of investment strategies for the country. You've obviously identified the problem in getting there, which is how do we do this in such a way that we don't diminish what we have and get a larger return on investment? And so I'm happy to hear that this discussion is still very prominently out there, and I thank you for your comments on those lines.
Thank you.
Hey, Jim, let me just chime in on that. I think a lot of that has come a long way also with leadership. And I think we have the right leadership right now at the foundation and at the board to look at this. I mean, we've given our inputs on EFA that, you think you keep this separate directorate, that what you do is also create a silo with a bunch of silos, and that these things need to work together. But I also think you're going to see, I see cultural changes happening in NSF to also say, hey, look, maybe we need to look at thinking about managing a portfolio, and that those directorates work all together, because you mentioned DARPA. I mean, I don't know how many people here have gotten their shots, okay? But that technology was done back in 2010, okay, with Dan Waterford, who was an Air Force doctor, and they went into DARPA and they said, look, let's start looking at things like messenger RNA and all that technology. And they started working with places like Moderna and Inova, okay, which basically was called the Pandemic Prevention Program, because they said, look, if someone unleashes a virus on us, how can we produce something in 60 days? And so we are now the beneficiaries of that, because that technology had been totally developed ahead of time. If we could look at some of the societal problems that Richard has talked about and have that portfolio, as well as not to diminish some of the research that we're doing, which, in DoD parlance, come of the blue sky, I think the country would be better off, because I think right now the citizens are saying, yes, we want to create new knowledge, but we also want to be able to say, how are we changing the world? And so when you think about that shot that you just got in your arm recently, that goes back to the kind of a structure of an organization like DARPA put together. And I think NSF can do it, because also I have been very impressed with Director Ponthanation's leadership, where he's talking about, look, we need to reduce all of these requirements. I mean, for some of us, like you said, you can go into a DARPA program manager's office, and as long as you're not proposing perpetual motion, and even if you do, they're willing to fund it based on that decision there, versus an extended peer review. He's looking at NSF grand challenges and a different type of organization. And he's really talking about, let's get out there and talk to the community. What is it that they need, and work with the industry and business? And I just know that because I just talked to him 3 days ago about the things that he is looking, and his vision, and as well working down with his assistant directors and new folks that are coming in right now. There's new positions for the AD for engineering and the AD for geology. So I think these type of things you're going to see and could happen, within a new NSF.
So I see Neil, you had your hand up for a bit there. Do you want to chime in here?
I'll be very quick. I wanted to thank Robert for an outstanding presentation, and to defend myself by saying one of the first things I look at is his ITIF letter that comes around. It's kind of a tie between that and FYI, which is an extraordinary contribution of what's going on in the world. And in Robert's case, I'm often amazed at how he must be 24/7. I mean, I just, the depth of thought and the amount of work in putting out those reports is very impressive. I'll make sure I slip it on one of those yellow boxes somewhere down the road. Let me comment briefly on the NSF culture. It's a long time ago now, so please forgive me. I haven't been intimately involved, and so Victor certainly can correct me here, but I believe NSF program directors have always had more discretion in making their funding decisions than might be the case in many other agencies, not DARPA, of course, but others. And one of the reasons I think maybe they've moved away from that, and I've been working with NSF since the 70s, advisory committees and whatnot. One of the reasons I think that program officers are hesitant to exercise that discretion is because the tight funding, and I would say the overly tight funding of NSF compared to the capacity around the nation to do outstanding research, has really forced the system into a more conservative mode. And the peer reviewers are more conservative. And I'm just guessing that over time, the program officers have become more conservative in terms of their funding decision and therefore more reliant on the reviewers' comments. It's just sort of a spiral that's taken place. You could double NSF funding today, right, from 8 to 16 or 8.5 to 17. If you just increase the funding grants by a year, 3 to 4. If you just increase the response to the meritorious proposals by, Vic can correct me, but maybe 35% to 40% or something like that. I'm just saying modest defensible changes in the way the NSF responds would immediately require another 8. And then anything new that you're asking the agency to do would be on top of that. Last thing I would say is, and it's in agreement with what Robert said, and I think I heard what Vic say about Poncha's approach. The agency, I think, has transformed to some extent its culture, at least from the time I was there, and it could transform more. It probably should be more transformative to be a larger partner, and it requires more funding to do this, a larger voice in getting these discoveries from lab to market and getting the benefits to the people in the way that the Biden administration wants to do. And anyway, for what it's worth, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Neil. It's been really great discussion. I'll move first from the audience to Kevin Marvel. You're welcome to ask your question now.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks to the panel. A great presentation. I'll throw two thought-provoking comments out there and let you all decide what you want to respond to. The first is that China coming up and becoming far more engaged in developing its infrastructure in science and technology, including spaceflight, enhancing its higher education, increasing its investment in research infrastructure, is remarkable. And we see it regularly in Science and Nature magazines with multi-page advertisements being taken out by institutions in China. It's relatively easy to get policymakers' attention by having a challenging rival, but it's also dangerous in many ways to go that route to try and increase our own funding. And I wondered about your thoughts on both sides of that. What are the dangers, and how can you approach it in a way that doesn't result, for example, in bans on US scientists interacting with Chinese researchers, which is an obvious knee-jerk reaction we've seen before. So that's one area of comment. The other one quickly is something that I only really started to realize a year or so ago, and it's getting more of an issue for me, and that is that in addition to missing out on populations of people who should be at the table and participating in science, technology, and engineering and addressing those, the lack of those people being here and participating in the efforts, in the US generally, we're having a demographic decline in the overall number of people who are eligible or who are at college age. we're just losing the population in general. It's shrinking. And to offset that, we really, truly, in the next decades, will need to bring people in from elsewhere. And with China and India more or less looking after themselves in many ways, and Europe already having infrastructure available, that kind of leaves Africa as an excellent place for us to draw excellent talent to the United States. How do we overcome that demographic decline of college-age people, which is the pipeline for the next generations of engineers and scientists in the country?
On the first thing about the decline, as I showed in the last slide, there is still large numbers are out there that are just untapped. So I just kind of refuse to believe that, you know, let's just face it, and this was echo one of my colleagues on the science board a few years ago. You know, for the past, since 1980, we have just disinvested in public education at the K through 12 level. We've just disinvested into it, okay? And we have to admit that. And so now we have to make that investment to get that pipeline going. I agree with you. You don't want to get xenophobic about one nation or another, you know, because, but we also, if we don't balance that investment, people are worried about science and security and our scientists talking to Chinese scientists or whomever. Well, if we don't invest in our domestic force, as the numbers that I've seen, we don't have to worry about anybody stealing anything. We've already given it to them, okay? We've basically not funded enough domestic graduate students, you know, on public money. We have said and used the model, well, we will always get our talent elsewhere. And we have done that. And now that we don't have it, that model doesn't work, okay? Just as the world that we saw in 1947, you know, when we were starting about creating the foundation has changed. And so I think one of the things we have to do is before I know we're going into this decline, all universities are looking at this demographic decline. But at the same time, if I look at the census numbers, those numbers are increasing. So there's a paradox there. And I think we're just not tapping enough and partnering enough with our communities, particularly our underserved communities, to fill that pipeline. Now that means that universities have to go into a business that they're not used to going into. But I would also argue with that. I mean, because in 1862, when they created the land grant institutions, what was their job? Their job was to be in the states and work with the communities, to take the technologies that were being developed and also provide education for citizens who couldn't go to the Ivy League schools. You know, that's the whole basis of the Agricultural Extension Service. So I think we need to relook at that and go out and do it, because not all of the talent and not everything has to be at Austin to Boston or on the coast. Now that means we have to be intentional. And that's something that's very different. I mean, professors are going to have to say, you know, I'm going to have to go get some students. You know, it's easy to get students from abroad, but I'm going to have to go out and dig deeper these students. And yes, that may mean I may have to compete more in terms of my publications. But my question is, are you going to be intentional about that? And are you going to be intentional about the interest of America?
I do have to step in and comment that Vic is on target in that we're wasting the talent that we have, particularly the middle and high school. We are losing the talent and not investing in a way that we need to in the years ahead. Japan, for example, does not utilize its women talent at all. It could be doing a whole lot better if it simply would agree to bring its talented women into the workforce. In the US, I think what we do is our middle and high school talent is not being recognized, nurtured, enhanced, and moved into higher education. And I think according to talent, and I think that can do bring a tremendous new source of talent to the country without having to go outside to look for it. I'm not opposed to the notion of bringing in, because that's pretty obvious, but I do think that we have to first deal with the loss of talent that we're addressing and address it right now.
So if I could jump in, I'd like to ask Richard directly one of Kevin's points about this dynamic of the concern over China really driving a lot of these proposals, but also the sort of the danger of overreaction in this space. And so I'd like your perspective from Congress. I mean, we've seen a number of bills that propose outright bans on Chinese graduate students coming to the U.S. to study in certain STEM fields, and those don't have broad support necessarily, but that those ideas are circulating in Congress is very significant. And so, if you could give these scientific society leaders here advice on how to constructively engage with Congress on this particular topic, in terms of both, noting the concern about, China. Becoming so strong in research relative to the U.S., but without necessarily driving overreaction.
Sure. I mean, I guess my preparatory comment would be that there are a lot of bills circulating in Congress, and so you have to always sort of see how much support they actually have. But they are a reflection in some sense of what's topical at the time. I think I'm seeing a broad discussion in Congress, certainly in the House, on the quote Chinese challenge and how to address it. And you've seen everything from trying to tighten access to US scientists and things, and also just investing in US capabilities. But I don't think there's a consensus yet. I think what we're seeing right now in the House is really, as we move from the American Rescue Act, the immediate pandemic recovery efforts, to talking about the next packages, I see that there are sort of competing visions for what it's about. Some are saying, well, we just plain old bricks and mortar, we have to revitalize our infrastructure. Whether there's a threat from China or not, we have uninvested in our infrastructure. We need to get that done. I have others saying, we really need to address climate change. That's one of the defining challenges of our society right now. And we can do that through infrastructure. We do it in other investments. And then others saying, referencing Neil's report and referencing other reports, we can't take leadership in science and innovation technology for granted, and it's ours to lose. We shouldn't assume that other nations are not going to be trying to follow some of the models we followed and even choose new models, but that they want to be developed and they want to have an innovation economy too. And so it's shame on us if we're not meeting that. So I think there's a little tension between what I'd call constructive approaches and ones that try to circle the wagons. And I think so far, the constructive approaches are what's been the main focus of attention so far in the Congress. But I think, as to Kevin's earlier point, I mean, I remember the discussions of Apollo, and it generated a lot of STEM careers and interest in these areas. For the mission agencies that were tasked with, NASA, for example, go to the point, once they achieved that goal of leadership, their budget went way down. It was seen, we've done it, we've been there, done it. And I think trying to create the rivalry again, to some extent, can detract from the fact that these are things we should be investing in any event. And we should be including all of our brain power at the table. And we have to think beyond sort of the ways we've tended to treat STEM talent and make the efforts to go. And that's not just an NSF role. That's a role for our other agencies and at the state level also.
There's one act that we could get moving, and that is childcare. In 1975, there was a bipartisan bill supported by Senate and the House, and both parties went to Richard Nixon's desk and he vetoed it. If he had not vetoed that 1975 bill, it would have made a great deal of difference right now. And I think that childcare is the biggest, most severe problem for women across the board, regardless of race or nationality.
I'm going to get off this now.
Etc. So I think that's one of the important acts that should be taken straight away. It's probably, the pandemic has affected women, scientists, engineers, mathematicians, physicians, because of the double whammy of homeschooling and trying to do research and trying to teach and so forth. So that's, I think, something we could do right away and make a huge difference.
Okay, I see we're just about at time. I'll turn to Michael to see if you want to let us entertain any more questions, or if you want to move to wrapping up now.
Well, I do want to be respectful of people's time, so apologies to Norm and to Chick. I do think it's important we finish up on time. So, Mitch, did you want to say anything to finish up, or will I just close the session?
No, I'll just say thank you to all our panelists. I thought this was a really productive discussion, particularly on the Endless Frontier Act. Great to have two former NSF directors here. So that's all for me.
Yeah, and I echo Mitch's thanks to everybody on the panel and to Neil for joining us, and to all of you who've stayed on the line for the last 2.5 hours. We have close to about 100 people right up until the end. So I think that just reflects the depth and importance of the conversation. And I think we've all taken, we'll all take away some of the messages and think about them in our own societies and organizations about how we can translate what we were talking about today to supporting our community support of the science infrastructure that is so key to making the progress and advancing human knowledge, which is what drives us all to get out of bed every day and do the work that we do. So thanks so much to Neil and to Vic and to Rita and to Bobbert and to Richard so much for your contributions today, and to everybody else for joining us. Join us for part 2 of the assembly in April, when we'll be taking a different topic, but one of very close importance and to our societies and associations about the future convening. Look forward to seeing you then, and have a great rest of your day. And thanks again for joining us. So bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis.
You're Michael.